Another cool thing we can do with classes is defining static properties and static functions or methods. So say for example, I wanted to have some number on here that I want to access or some value that I want to access from the car class, but I don't want to instantiate the class like this. You can see that every time we need to access anything on that class, we're actually using an instance. By using the new keyword, we pass the name of the class and then the values that the constructor is expecting. Then we have an instance of this class. And then on that instance, that's where we do everything that we need to do. You know, if we want to access something, then we would access it on the instance, or if we want to access the methods or a function, we do that via the instance as well. So say for example, I have a property that I'm gonna call number of wheels, for example, right? And I want to set this to, for example, 4. So say I want to be able to access this number of wheels, which is going to be 4, but then I don't want to instantiate the class like this, right? And usually you want to do this when you want to access utility properties or functions or methods. So what I can do is I can make this static. So I can say static, and then I put the name of the property, and then I set it equal to some value that I want. And another thing you would see is sometimes you can have this in uppercase. So I can have something like num underscore of underscore wheels, and then set this equal, let's say 6 in case they have some pickup truck. So for a car, we can say the number of wheels is, or the max number of wheel. So max number of wheels, right? So that's going to be 6, and this is static, right? So now if I come down and from the Acura, if I try to access this value, you can see that I don't have access to it because the Acura is an instance of the car class. Now, if I want to access this static property, I have to use the name of the class itself. So if I say car, which is the class, not an instance, and then I do that, you can see that I have access to the max number of wheels. And I can go ahead and print that. If I run the code, you can see that I got 6. And we can also do the same for methods. So I can go down inside of the car class, and then I can say static car stats, for example, right? So let's say we're gonna take some numbers. So let's say we're gonna take the mile, which is gonna be a number. So let's do mile and then a number. And then what we want to do is to just let's say return. So let's say we're gonna return an object. So I'm gonna do open and close curly braces, and then I'm gonna say mileage, that's the mile. And let's put another property. So let's say type, and let's say a string, and we're gonna say hybrid, for example, right? I'm just coming up with something. Now we have this static car stats where we can pass in a mileage, and then it's gonna give us some object of some sort, right? And you can think of something more clever than this. So now what I can do is I can just go down there, and then I can just access this directly on the class. And then here, if I put a dot, you can see that I have car stats, and then I can pass in, let's say 10, for example. So if I go ahead and run this, you can see that I get the console log here. So I get the mileage, which is 10, and then I get the type, which is hybrid. Now that's really not a very good example, but you can think of something more useful to do in your application. Now there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So for example, if I need to access any of the properties on the class that are not static, then I can't do that inside of the static methods by using the this keyword. And I can show you this. So if I go in here and I say this, and then I do dot, you can see that I have access to the function itself, but then I don't have access to anything else. Because remember, whenever you call this inside of the class itself, the this keyword is really creating an instance and then give you access to these properties. So if you actually want to access, for example, this property inside of the method, inside of the class itself, you actually have to use the class itself. So you can say car dot, and then you have access to the max wheel. You can see it's coming up here. So I can access it that way if I want to do something with it. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So say I just want to console log it. So I would say console.log, and I can pass in the max wheel in here and run this. You can see that I got the 6 again. And you usually see developers using these static properties and methods for utility reasons. So if you want to keep track of some, some number on the class that's never going to change or something like that, then that's a good reason to use the static, because you can just use the class name and then the name of the property or the name of the method and then access it that way. Now, one last thing I want to mention about static methods and properties is that you can also use the this keyword inside of static block to access static properties. For example, you can see here I'm using the car and then access this number of wheels, right? But because I'm inside of a static block, as you can see here, I can actually use the this keyword. So if I do this, you can see that I have no problem. But if I take the same code, right? I copy this, and for instance, inside of this setter here, I paste it in, you can see that I'm getting an error. Because when I'm not inside of a static block, the this keyword is actually referring to an instance of the car class. But when I'm inside of a static block, then it's referring to the class name itself or just the class, and then I can access just the property that is static that I have. So this is a little bit tricky, but that's just something that I see that I didn't mention before, and it's quite important that you understand this. So if I'm inside of a block that is not static, then I can't access static properties or method, because when I'm inside of a block that is not static, whenever I call the this keyword, then I'm actually referring to an instance of the class. That's what happens under the hood. But when I'm inside of a static block, as you can see here, then when I access the this keyword, then I'm actually referring to the class name itself or the class and not an instance of the class. So just make sure you keep that in mind.